Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Really appreciate CASC hosting these public science seminars. I think they're super important and really excited to be back because I was a global change fellow with CASC during my graduate work. So I'm a social scientist and science communicator. Formerly, I was with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program and started with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Human Dimensions Branch this past October. And today I'm going to be sharing a topic that I'm really passionate about, utilizing social science and natural resource management, specifically to improve climate adaptation decisions made by our natural resource managers. My goal is that if you're not already interested or familiar with social science, that you might be after this, or you might be curious about how to use social science in your own work. I'm going to be going over what social science is and why I think it's critical to conservation work, using some examples from my graduate research at NC State and also from my time with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. I look forward to answering your questions at the end of the presentation. So let's dig in. The conservation challenges facing natural resource managers are complex, they're intersectional, they encompass concerns like climate change, loss of biodiversity, land use changes, air and water quality, forest management, visitor use management, community engagement, all of these things and more. Honestly, this is just to name a few. And if you're all familiar with what our natural resource managers are facing, you know that they have a lot on their plates. They're responsible for managing the way in which people and ecosystems interact and making sure we have a sustainable use of all our resources. And that is a big task. At the heart of all these issues, you have intertwined social and ecological factors influencing decision-making and human behavior. So think for a minute about how you might go about addressing something like wolf reintroduction without fully understanding public opinion on it. That could easily jeopardize the success of that effort. And we've seen that play out frequently as a result of people's attitudes and beliefs about predator reintroduction. Or how would you go about water quality on a watershed without engaging with local landowners, farmers, city dwellers? These are all human movement, human behavior issues that influence our natural resources. And so these are all issues where natural resource managers are having to think about people and how those interact with our environment. So what is social science? How is it helpful here? Social science disciplines focus on a variety of social phenomena. Think markets, governance, politics, culture, demographics, narratives, socioeconomics, policy, law, all of the factors that contribute to what we call a society, and the social processes that reinforce our societal and cultural norms, basically how our beliefs play out in institutions. And then you can also understand our individual attributes, our values, our beliefs, our knowledge, our motivations. What are our behaviors? Those individual behaviors and beliefs, perceptions, they're influenced by the culture and society we live in. They're also all really individualistic. So at different scales, social scientists focus in on a variety of research topics or theories. For example, at an individual scale, one might study perceptions, values, attitudes, behaviors of a natural resource user. And at a global scale, social scientists might study how narratives or ideas change and influence the study of policy documents, global meetings, or even how ideas are represented on things like social media. You can study social phenomena at multiple scales simultaneously. Social scientists might examine how changes in markets, policies, or demographics at a local scale would influence, or at a national scale would influence local decision-making or socioeconomic outcomes. So how do we apply and talk about this with relationship to conservation? We have both classic social sciences, including things like sociology, anthropology, political science, geography, history, psychology, and applied social science, things like education, communication studies, which is what my background's in, development studies, law. And though they're not technically social sciences, the arts and humanities are often drawn upon to critically analyze, represent, and shape social processes and phenomena, often applying a similar set of theories and methods to make empirical observations. Incorporating social science into conservation and environmental management often helps us produce more robust and effective policies, actions, and outcomes. And this is a really commonly used and referenced wheel by Bennett et al. It's showing just basically the overlap of different social sciences and where they all kind of fall in relation to each other. So you can see on here the classic and applied social sciences, and then things that are more interdisciplinary and emerging. More specifically, within natural resource management, social science helps us understand the human dimensions of conservation. It's powerful because it gives us more information to make better decisions. It has an ability to describe, examine, and innovate our thinking and ideas. And we can use it in a variety of circumstances to inform a whole swath of challenges. Incorporating social science can lead us to make better decisions for both the environment and for human well-being, because we're able to better weigh social and ecological trade-offs and more effectively understand the impact of these decisions on stakeholders and the public. Think about it as you're using more broader, scientifically based samples of information to inform your decision making. And we know all of these environmental changes fueled by climate change that I mentioned earlier are pushing natural resource managers to respond. So there's two kinds of camps for climate action. First is mitigation, which is action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit the amount of warming our planet will experience. And the second is adaptation, which is behavioral response to reduce risk and improve outcomes related to climate change that are already happening. Adaptation is where I'm going to focus more on today, if that already wasn't clear, with the focus on social science. And so adaptation allows us to adjust and respond to various climate risks that threaten livelihoods, health, and ecosystems. Adaptation might be more familiar in terms of biophysical solutions, things like green roofs, living shoreline, native plant and pollinator habitat, drought-resistant crops, and seawalls. These are all biophysical responses, but they're the result of human behavior, laws, policies, public support, partnership efforts. Adaptation can also mean things like managed retreat, improved pedestrian access, public transportation development, other changes to the built environment, and also human behavior. These are all really varied and broad responses, but they're all intended to displace risk and leverage opportunity, and they all require changes to our individual and collective behavior. Social science can help us approach climate adaptation in multiple ways. We can gain a deeper understanding of the drivers of behavior, and we can improve our interventions with that knowledge. Behavior can be super hard to understand. There are different social, economic, historical, psychological factors. Just think about all the things that I discussed that social science studies, all of the social phenomena, social processes, that all impacts our behavior. Sometimes it's hard to identify what's influencing behavior, and that's where we can use social science. Because adaptation requires our individual and collective behavioral shifts, it's really difficult to accomplish this without understanding the social systems that influence that action or lack of action. And that's where social science can come in. On a global scale, you have a lot of experiences like nature-based tourism or experiential education that engages people with conservation ideas or actions. Think about citizen science on a trip. You're engaging directly with scientists, you're helping with conservation work. These are experiences that can be really transformative for people, even just being out in nature, hiking, feeling more connected to it. These are things that can be transformative in people's pro-environmental behavior. So conservation action, climate action. How do we understand and drive more people to engage in these behaviors? And how do we change this at different scales? Examples of this can be really clear when we look at Antarctic tourism. And that might seem random, but I think it's all going to make sense. So Antarctica is a really interesting context and place for looking at behavior change on a global scale when you're looking at climate action and conservation. So the rapidly changing climate and growing tourism industry are compounding factors that threaten Antarctica's biodiversity and stability. The tourism industry in Antarctica began in the 1960s. They now see over 100,000 visitors a year. That might not sound like a lot, but if you look at this map and the highlighted sections on this map where the little dots are, these are areas where visitors are coming, and these are also areas where really sensitive bird colonies are. And you can see that a lot of the tourism is happening just in the peninsula of Antarctica, the majority of it. And that's also the places where human impacts would affect birds or wildlife. So it might not sound like a lot of people, but for this amount of space and where the continent is, it is a lot of people. Yeah. The first of these expeditions was predicated on the idea that a trip to Antarctica was super inspirational and so moving that everyone that left the continent would be really motivated to protect it and effectively become a steward. But if we're talking in terms of Antarctic tourism, they've coined this term ambassadorship. So that's what I'll be using to reference stewardship. It's basically the same thing. And I'm sure you've heard all kinds of versions of the concept. So this educational experience, which in turn is supposed to reduce the visitor's footprint, both on the continent and after their trip at home, has protected the industry, which is self-regulated, from a lot of outside regulations. Its validity has been up for debate for decades, whether or not a trip to Antarctica actually changes people's behavior. And tourists themselves, visitors, are really hard to study after the fact because everyone is super international and it's hard to track people across large swaths of land and also just across large portions of time. So it's possible for educational experiences like this to have a transformative impact. We can see that in the literature, but the extent to which it's claimed to happen and the offsetting it's supposed to do against the carbon emissions required to visit from long-haul flights and from boat pollution, the wildlife disturbances, the offsetting might not be equal to the impacts. All this to say, we need to understand what's actually motivating these pro-environmental behaviors when people have experiences in protected areas like these. What are the barriers? What are the challenges? What are the influences on their behavior? And so with all the years of attention given to tourists, which, as I said, are notoriously difficult to study after their trip, some researchers at NC State and I questioned how we might better understand this transformative experience context from a lesser studied viewpoint. So we turned our attention to tour guides, who have historically been really good modelers of behavior for guests that they guide, who are responsible for educating, ensuring safety, minimizing impacts, navigating, inspiring, and influencing the guests that they guide. So if we can understand more about this particular population that's interacting directly with tourists, maybe we can get a better sense for the visitor experience. Maybe we can better understand global barriers to pro-environmental behavior that exists for people. Why would someone not be able to engage in conservation behavior? Maybe we can learn about that through learning about tour guide behavior. These are insights we're lacking from a population that has a really deep personal connection to Antarctica. They return year after year to guide for decades, and we weren't learning from them. So we asked them, we did interviews online with guides to learn about their conservation behavior. And what we've learned is that tour guides engage in conservation behavior. They are ambassadors, they're stewards, they have a huge role as educators and modelers for the guests that they interact with daily. This is influenced heavily by four main factors, which I'm going to go over. These factors were found in both the literature about guiding and reinforced through through conversations with guides. So the first one that I've highlighted here is the duty or responsibility that they feel in their job and the formal and informal roles that requires of them. An example of this would be that some of the guides discussed wanting the industry itself to be more encouraging of the discussion of impacts that tourism is having on Antarctica on the trips. But they often felt constrained due to the social systems and kind of pressure to maintain business as usual with the companies that they guided for. And so for guides that told us that they didn't care if they lost their jobs as long as they were able to protect Antarctica from harmful business practices, we could see there that their sense of duty was really a strong motivating factor in their ambassadorship behavior. The next is a sense of place, more commonly place attachment, you may have heard of. Basically, how much connection you have to a specific environment or location. And in this instance, how connected the guides felt to Antarctica. And this can be influenced by time spent in Antarctica, but also by things like cultural narratives that they may have grown up with. It's a really interesting concept. There's lots of literature on it, but it was really apparent for guides here. Next is how confident and capable they felt. So how much capacity they had to be able to both do their job and model specific stewardship behaviors that sometimes required them to go above and beyond the job that they were already doing. These factors that influenced this were things like years of experience, so newer guides versus more experienced guides. We saw differences there. Trainings, the different skills and knowledge that they brought with them from different past careers, and then different resources available to them while they guided. And then community support turned out to be a really important factor. So even just the social dynamics of a boat crew or the mentorship they were receiving from more experienced guides really impacted their ability to model stewardship behavior. A lot of guides said other guides being able to speak up and kind of back them up when they had to have a hard conversation or talk to a guest about a behavior made it easier for them to do the same as opposed to when they didn't have that same support. And so how do we encourage more of that? How do we take these insights and incorporate that into the programming that the guides lead with the visitors? How do we ensure that the guides have the support that they need to model those behaviors? Because the industry is claiming that all these things are happening. And so how do we make sure that it is and that the guides are able to actually enact those behaviors? How do we take this learning and apply it to a larger context that influences how we understand behavior change related to conservation, especially in protected areas? Because you have a lot of these same components happening with guides in different areas and across the globe in protected areas. Because they're often seen, guides are often seen as having the potential to be change agents or actors that play a significant role in initiating and implementing change for others. But it seems difficult that we could expect them to change behavior of others without understanding what's actually driving their own behavior. And so this is certainly not the end of this work. We developed a model of protected area ambassadorship, which I did not include here to avoid going too into the weeds, but I am happy to share if anyone's interested. Also, this work is being prepared for a publication submission, so it will be available at some point. So this is just one example of how social science can help us understand different populations, behaviors, beliefs, and then potentially design more effective interventions for behavior change. And in a totally different part of the world, another example, Managers at National Park Service units are dealing with the impacts of climate disasters. We see this in the news. We see this in the aftermath of events like Hurricane Helene in North Carolina or the LA wildfires. We see a lot of the biophysical impacts of these events to landscapes, wildlife, habitat, cultural sites, water systems. But what we don't necessarily always jump to, especially in natural resource management, is the impact on humans that events like these have. Specifically for the National Park Service staff that deal with climate disasters, both as first responders, sometimes, and as people with families or friends that live and work in the same location. Their workplace and home can be destroyed by a single wildfire or a hurricane. The plot of land that they've been working to restore for the past 10 years can be destroyed in an afternoon. An entire habitat for an endangered species that they've been trying to save, or a cultural artifact that they've dedicated their lives and careers to learning about and preserving can be swept away in a rockfall or burned. These are impacts happening right now. These are things that people are having to adapt to all the time. And for natural resource managers to really truly adapt to a changing climate, these mental and emotional impacts must be considered and addressed as part of an adaptation response. Disasters can take a huge toll on individuals and communities. Things like sudden displacement, property loss, even injury and death. These are common disaster outcomes that are documented. Social science helps us recognize the psychological and social toll that these disasters bring. Communities can be fractured, resources can be scarce. The individual psychological impacts of events like these affect people's ability to be able to respond and support others. You have staff juggling multiple responsibilities, managing their families, evacuating them, sometimes evacuating multiple times in the same event. You have them managing the park's response, bringing in mental health support, resources, and they're the ones that generally could utilize it the most, but they're responsible for calling those people. They were working long hours, they're working stressful hours, they're worried. There's a lot of impacts to mental and social health from climate disasters, and they're only going to increase. And so for a baseline, social science can really help us understand how disasters like these impact our psychological and social well-being. There's a lot of different ways to go about doing this, but I did some interviews with staff and gathered firsthand accounts of people's experiences. This is really helpful here because it can give us rich information and also understand where actions are needed the most. So you can hear directly from impacted employees saying stress levels and workload from managing disasters increased. And at the same time, they're dealing with the loss of park resources or their home, making that a traumatic experience. That's something we see in the literature too, from people who have experienced natural disasters like these. Think about like Hurricane Katrina. There's a lot of data and information from that disaster that backs up a lot of what people are saying firsthand. So social science can help us understand why building individual and collective resilience can help staff and communities. And it can help us understand how to do that better. So preparing people ahead of an event like this and increasing their social support can make a huge difference for their well-being during and after an event. One of the park staff that I spoke to talked about having an interdisciplinary approach to being ready, making sure they had emergency plans and guides and knew who they could reach out to both personally and professionally to help support them through the event would make such a difference. Another staff member said that during the Dixie Fire in California, having a broader fire community to reach out to and get support from made all the difference during that event. He said knowing that there's a community of people who have also been through this was really important. And so ideas about building resilience, that means we're building social cohesion. We're building stronger community ties. These are echoed in their responses. They're also echoed in the literature. And so we know that those are effective interventions that can be done to help people adapt to this. Social science can give us pathways to build that cohesion. We can do workshops, civic engagement, building connections, building partnerships and collaborations. Natural resource managers can incorporate adaptations like these into emergency planning, funding requests, communication materials. They can be ready with mental health support before an event. If they're in an area where they know they're maybe going to get a lot of wildfire, they can be ready with mental health support after an event because they've prepared for it in their planning and in their funding requests. They can be encouraging stronger community knowledge sharing with other National Park Service units or even other public land agencies that have to deal with the same impacts, because climate disasters don't know boundaries and they affect Forest Service land and Fish and Wildlife land, all BLM land, all of these federal land management agencies that have to deal with climate disasters at the same scale and scope. They can be working together to reduce the amount of impact that these events can have on people's mental and social health, because they can have that support from a community that is also dealing with the same things. So these are different ways, hopefully, to adapt to impacts that are going to affect a lot of people across a lot of different National Park Service units and other lands. So we've seen two really different examples here of how social science can be used, both in a really specific circumstance, like in climate disaster aftermath and building resilience for individuals and communities, and for broader, more global issues of how do we engage people with climate action and conservation. And so social science overall is an effective tool in designing, understanding, and then implementing climate adaptation strategies. It can be utilized to understand individual and collective drivers of behavior and the systemic barriers that exist. And then we can use it to create better and more effective interventions. And so I hope that these two case studies presented have highlighted how malleable social science can be in climate adaptation work, and to also demonstrate how much more successful adaptation will be with the addition of social science. And that is all I have for you today. And here's all my references. And now I'm excited to hear what questions you might have.